Today we're going to talk about the fall of paganism, so at the other end of this antiquity. This is a romantic painting of, from the Romantic era anyway, of the Christians going after the poor Druids' trees, which is something that happened. So that is...
With a chainsaw that they didn't have.
Yeah, well. All right, so let's just looking at this. There's this amazing transformation in late antiquity and coming into then the early Middle Ages. When you take the Roman Empire as it had existed at the beginning of the 4th century, at the the year 300, almost everybody is an adherent to, in some sense or other, of the old gods of all of the old faiths. It's not one unified church or religion or anything like that. Far from it. It's actually all kinds of local and divergent different practices that extend all across the empire, but in some sense they are all similar. And so in modern times people have now and retroactively lumped it all together and called it paganism. And so essentially that big purple swash of more or less everybody, less than 10% of the population were Christian, a smaller number than that are Jewish, and then there are other religious traditions as of the year 300 that people would be adherents to, and this is sometimes called like other, for example, mystery religions, so Mithraism, Manichaeism, Isis, these kind of things that essentially have grown out of the old gods, but are in fact maybe what was now being called like essentially new religious traditions that have more of a identity structure to them, the way what we now think of as religion, as opposed to the individuality of the paganism. So then just to getting to the end of that, by the time all of those Christians are done chopping down all of those Druids' trees and everything like that, by the time you get to 600, the Christians amount to a supermajority. We still have Jews. The other are fewer and farther and between, and going to be less and less of them. And then pagans are now, way on the outs and just in the outskirts of society in the woods and things like that. So we're going to ask, I guess, today, how and why did this happen? And was that change inevitable? And how much changed and how much stayed the same? And so one of these things I want to kind of point out is that part of the issue that we have, and I'm even going to show this between here, there's two images. We have kind of the Byzantine Church, maybe, as we call it, and that's our term for it, looking back, because Byzantines, which is to say the Greek East, they didn't call themselves that. They called themselves Romans. And the reason why, for example, down to this day, Romania is called Romania, and that why, when we did this lecture on Rumi, why this poet in Turkey is called Rumi, or in other words, the Roman, is because Turkey is also called Romania because all of the Greeks in the East, there, the Byzantines, call themselves Romans and understand themselves as being Romans. And so one of the things that has happened, because we have this picture that comes especially to us from the cast of thousands movies, these great epics of the 50s and 60s, Ben-Hur and Cleopatra and everything like that, we have this picture of Roman paganism that especially focuses on the earlier time period. And so we are very much thinking of these kind of Parthenon-like temples, as opposed to the later Roman structures that were already displacing things like that. So the idea, for example, we now think of a building like a basilica, and we think of them only in their kind of Christian context, that a basilica is what a Christian church looks like, or a synagogue. And in fact, though, that's just a Roman public building. And likewise, if we think of what, for example, a monastery looks like, where you have a basilica and then attached to it is this kind of courtyard with these little stoa, this little colonnades all around it, and we think of that as being a religious building, a monastery. But in point of fact, that is simply the form of what a Roman villa would look like. That's what a Roman noble family's house would be like. And so in that sense, all of the things that we kind of think of as being these kind of Christian or medieval Christian forms are in fact simply late Roman civic things that are just repurposed for Christianity in this transformation. So what changed, what was inevitable, and how did it happen? So what was paganism? That's the first question. So the vantage that we look at the past here in the West anyway is based on Christian conceptions of that past. And so when we even say this, the West, what is the West? And so the Western civilization is largely, I think, a secularized euphemism for the older term, which would have been Christendom. And so at a certain point, as we have now secularized, we have replaced that. We said the Judeo-Christian past, and we can now call it the West, or Europe is also one of the euphemisms that emerged out of that wasn't there. But even if we replace, I'm going to argue, phrases like AD or Anno Domini with CE to say that this is 2018 in the Common Era, the underlying number and count remain the same. So we're still counting from that Year of the Lord designation of a Christian background that is a bias that we have to kind of work through if we're going to look at this history. So because we view, anyway, the idea of religion itself, anything that we're even looking at religion, we have these Judeo-Christian lenses, or in some cases, as we have in a little bit broader perspective here, Abrahamic lenses at the very least, so Islamo-Judeo-Christian lenses. So again, what is paganism? This is actually, I like this picture. A couple years ago, we went and did a tour of Sicily and looked at some of the amazing medieval buildings and things like that. So the cathedral in Syracuse is in fact built around. You can see the original temple here. That's the ancient temple of Athena. Essentially the columns, and they've just blocked in walls the columns that would make a building that would have otherwise looked like the Parthenon, and now it becomes initially, so it went from pagan temple to Athena to, when they first walled it in like that, what would be called an early Catholic/Orthodox, before the schism and separation, church together, cathedral together. Then it was conquered by the Muslims, and so it became a mosque. Then the Normans took it from that, and so it went from having been a Greek-speaking cathedral to a mosque to then being a Latin cathedral, which it continued to be, since then. Okay, so although we're going to say then that Jesus and his followers emerged from a kind of rural culture, so the original very, very beginnings and origins of Christianity are a rural phenomenon. When Christianity actually does its kind of spreading throughout the Roman Empire, it does so as largely an urban phenomenon. And so when this very critically important missionary or early thinker in Christianity, Paul, starts spreading things, he plants communities in the Greek-speaking cities of the Roman Empire. And so when Nicene Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire under Theodosius, it's also largely an urban phenomenon. And so at that point, in the 4th century, at the end of the 4th century, temples and cities, as they were abandoned, they were often repurposed in churches, as the old religion is increasingly relegated to the rural peasantry. And so the pagani is that term in Latin. So essentially the people who are out in the pagani, the pagan, it required that meaning. So originally pagan means the rural zones or people from the sticks. And so it began to acquire the meaning religiously as quite a derogatory term after the 4th century, after Christianity is already in the ascendant. So the remaining pagans then are viewed as Hicks from the sticks, or alternatively because they're outside the bounds of the paganus of the Christian community. So it's not a word that pagans chose for themselves, although in new revivals, there's a whole bunch of neo-pagan movements which don't have continuity with ancient paganism, but are conscious revivals of in the 20th century especially, but now in the 21st too, of paganism. And in so doing, a lot of people have embraced that word, and so people will call themselves pagans, and so it's sometimes hard to decide whether we want to use it or not. I went through a whole bunch of lectures where I spent a whole time saying polytheist all the time, and people couldn't know what that meant. So anyway, we've decided to use it. So polytheist is also a way that we can do it, but it also has when we say polytheist, it also has a very Abrahamic lens. The reason polytheists weren't sitting around questioning, their number one end all be all was not how many gods do you worship. It's only when you become a monotheist that you really get upset about multiple gods or something like that. So I would just say that even that word is still using or relying upon our Abrahamic lenses. So one of the ways that we inevitably, I think, look back on Greco-Roman, the old gods, is through mythology, which again is going to be, I think, based on our Judeo-Christian lenses. So because of the survival of classical literature, we're exposed to Roman, the old gods, and the old religion through the mythology. And so, therefore, we may be aware of the literary attempts that are fairly late to systematize all of the pantheons, and so the syncretism. So as people who have local gods, then they start to go around and they interpret their gods as being the same as other people's gods. So they say, well, in some ways that our god Zeus, who is the king of the gods, he obviously is the same divinity as your Roman god Jupiter. And so as a result, there is a syncretism where Zeus becomes Jupiter, Athena, Minerva, Ares, Mars, etc., although these are always not quite, doesn't quite work. So Mars is a much more important god to the Romans, for example, and quite different than Ares, who's quite a minor god in the Greek pantheon, for example. It's an important god in the Hercules show, right? So I don't know, Ares, I think he was a big character. But anyway, Mars was more important. So because literature survives, unlike the experience of non-literate masses, it's very hard always when we're doing history to kind of revive what was the common people, what were slaves experiencing, what did they believe, what was the experience of women. It's not written down as much, and it's not saved and preserved as much. So, and also then because Abrahamic religions, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are very focused on Scripture. In a sense that makes us kind of feel like that religion is always all about text. And so, as people in the West sailed all around the world, they went and asked essentially. Chinese people, they asked Indian people, well, what's your Bible like? And so they privileged, in fact, what was written in the kind of texts for these different traditions that they encountered in a way that the people themselves maybe didn't view them that way, right? Because that's alien maybe to their tradition, which is not so focused on being a people of the book or something like that. And certainly for paganism, although there are very revered texts like Homer and Hesiod, that these are not equivalent to how, for example, Quran is in Islam. So lived paganism is much more than the mythology or relations among the pantheon. And so while syncretism allowed pagans to get along with a shared worldview, individual practices were going to be very highly localized in how everybody was actually having their lived experience of paganism. Okay. So, like I say, although Jupiter may have been understood to be Zeus when you're talking to Greeks, his worship in Rome is particular to Rome. So Roman paganism is primarily about ritual observances rather than doctrine, and they were performed very legalistically as a contract between divine forces and humans. And so the Roman formula for their old religion was always do ut des, I give in order that you might give. And it illustrates essentially Roman thinking behind things like animal sacrifice, but also behind a whole comprehensive ritual behaviors that accompanied all lived activity. So essentially there are all of these forces that are everywhere. They're infinite in their number almost, and you are maybe aware and name and anthropomorphize some of the big ones. But there are gods of your household, there are gods of the threshold, every single thing that you're doing and crossing. And so as a result of that, it's key, since they are acting sort of chaotically and not just with your good, they don't have necessarily your best interests at heart at all. They may well hurl a lightning bolt at you, and you don't know particularly why that happened. part of the idea then is I give in order that you give. You're trying to propitiate them through doing various ritual activities or sacrifice or any other number of ways you're doing that. Tim?
I think the statue is interesting. It's the same in the Renaissance when they have the statues where the foot leaves the edge or approaches the edge. It's meant to resemble that you have one foot in the physical world, yet one foot in like eternal or eternal.
Neat. I like
It's
that
similar to
symbology
this.
of the
So
of
it's similar,
Zeus
like
here.
Zeus in
So
both worlds.
He's in
by the foot.
transcending. In other words, he's in the heavens, but he also is being his effects are here on earth. Okay. So there was no concept of the separation of church and state in the Roman state. So this is a statue of the Emperor Augustus operating not only as the head of the state, but also the head of the state religion. And so Romans, as you know, are these toga-clad guys, and when they're wearing the togas the way you normally see them, that means they're essentially acting as a politician. And so, like it's called, they wear like the toga candida, which is like where we get our word candidate. It just means white toga. And so that's how they're doing it as politicians. But they put the toga up over there like this, as you see, and suddenly they're a priest. And so that's why, that's how that works, right? And so anyway, so the state here then is intimately connected with religious ritual activity. So the republic, its officers, they're all sacred. The politicians are filling public priesthoods. So Caesar, Julius Caesar, so Augustus's uncle or adopted father, was elected Pontifex Maximus, which is the title that's still sometimes given to the Pope. Chief priest of the College of Pontiffs prior to his consulship, or just to say his civic office. And so for us, even as we kind of do this, even separating these out and saying, well, one of these is his religious office and one of them is his, secular office or whatever, in some ways are not the case, since they're actually also religious. And so all time and space, the calendar, for example, the sacred boundaries of the city of Rome, what you could do on any particular given day, these are all figured out by what's propitious, and they're figured out by civic magistrates who are also acting as augurs and priests and censors, who are all part essentially of the kind of combined priest/civic magistrate class of paganism or Roman pagan religious observance. So just to kind of get a sense of this, I want to take a description from a text here by Pliny the Elder. He's famous, and you might know him as a popular, he's kind of like a Carl Sagan of his day, in this he's a popular scientist. He is, by which to say, he's writing texts that everybody loves to read, and that gets people excited about science. And he's known for also when he's observing, for example, for some reason around Naples, the mountain is starting to smoke and things like that. And so he's a scientist. He's going to go observe that, and then it ends up blowing up, Vesuvius, right? And so that is the end of Pompey the Elder, unfortunately. So he dies not in Pompeii, but anyway, at that same Vesuvius eruption. So Pompey says, anyway, regarding customs, when we are at table, for instance, it is the universal practice we see to take the ring from off the finger. Another person, again, will take some spittle from his mouth and place it with his finger behind an ear to propitiate and modify disquietude of mind. When we wish to signify applause, we have a proverb which tells us we should press the thumbs. To salute summer lightning with clapping of the hands is the universal practice in all nations. If, when eating, we happen to make mention of a fire that has happened, we avert the inauspicious omen by pouring water beneath the table. These usages have been established by persons who entertain the belief that the gods are ever present in all our affairs and at all hours, and who have therefore found the means of appeasing them by our vices even. So, you can just see here that in his little list, this is just the top scratch of the surface of all of the things that you could constantly be doing. The little ritual that you have every time you cross a threshold, all the things. I mean, these are things that we maintain by just like doing like a little bit of crossing our fingers and knocking on wood. But essentially, as you see, it's a universal practice for doing any number of these things, pouring a little water under the table, spittle, and so on and so forth. Also, in the Roman sense, these have to be done very exactingly legally. The Romans are very legally minded. And so that has to be done quite correctly, Pliny says. So it's a general belief that without a certain form of prayer, it would be useless to immolate a sacrificial victim. So if you don't do it exactly right, what's the point of you even doing it? It's not going to have any effect. And that, with such an informality, the gods would be consulted to little purpose. And then, besides, there are different forms of address to the deities, one form for entreating, another form for averting their ire, another for commendation. We see too how that our supreme magistrates use certain formulae for their prayers, that not a single word may be omitted or pronounced out of its place. We are told that, he says, King Tullus Hostilius, while attempting in accordance with the books of Numa to summon Jupiter from heaven by means of a sacrifice similar to that employed by him, was struck by lightning in consequence of his omission to follow certain forms with due exactness. And so this is always, for the pagan, on the, it's a scary worldview, and this is always completely on the possibility that if you just do one little thing wrong, then bam, the king gets killed. He's trying to do it right. He's trying to propitiate Jupiter, but he pisses him off. So what I'm going to argue then is, despite kind of the rosy way that we kind of tend to look back on paganism in general with rosy lenses, so the historic connection, Christian connection, especially this side of the Victorian era, which we tend to look at everything through that prism and imagine that everything was way, way more socially conservative going all the way back. But in fact, it's just because of our perspective of being on this side of the Victorian era. In a lot of ways, things were a lot less like that on the other side of it, because things don't always only go in one direction. They go in two directions. And so anyway, but looking at it this way, in recent perspective, we tend to think of everything must have been way more prudish by the time you get to the Middle Ages, because if the Victorians were that much prudish, how much worse could medieval people be? And so because of that connection with sex and sin, and with Anglo-Protestant moralizing against things like alcohol, that makes people in the post-Christian world, I think, this idea that paganism was a lot of fun, and that if everybody hadn't become Christians, then history would have been a lot more fun. And so I would say here, anyway, a postmodern person then would doubtless find this penetration of ritual obligations into every aspect of personal, familial, and civic life decidedly unfun. And so anyway, and that's kind of the core. So paganism is obligatory custom in every aspect of a person's life. Okay, so how does it all work? So these are just some of the components of Roman paganism, the lived experience. So there's all of these personal rituals. You sneeze, you say Gesundheit. That's one of the ones we keep, right? So living dutifully to family. So you have this still is true in Toronto. I can never believe the amount of obligations that some of my Chinese Canadian friends have to their families and things like that, And so anyway, living dutifully to family. Reverence for ancestors. Obedience to sacred and civic law. It's the same, one and the same. Expiation for ill omens. Something went wrong and you have to do something amazing. So there was Caesar himself is having a triumph. He's celebrating triumph. He's at the height of his power, but the wheel falls off of his chariot. That is an ill omen, and so maybe he's going to get assassinated. That might be what that's prefiguring. But anyway, we don't know what the gods were trying to say. But in order to propitiate that, even Caesar, what he has to do is then go up on his knees, all the way up the whole Capitoline, every kind of step, and do something, like a ritual on each step of the way, in order to essentially propitiate for this really bad omen. Anyway, so expiation for that. Offering sacrifices to the gods, consulting auspices and oracles. So the Romans were continuously doing this. This is the kind of thing where you watch the birds as they fly in a particular way to decide whether we can have a market day or not today, whether it's okay to go to war. Reading also all kinds of other different ways. Reading, for example, the livers of gooses to decide whether, and that means that the gods are happy with us, that... Anyway, any number of things that you might ask about. Praying to the gods. Reverence for cult objects. So either in the big senses of when you have in the temples, there's a cult statue. And those statues will also have all kinds of rituals done for them in terms of being clothed, and they walk around in processions, and there are all kinds of different things that are like that. But also people will have all kinds of little ritual objects that they might be important to them sacredly in their lived experience. Civic rights, so having things like an assembly, getting all together when you're having in some ways it's like a Congress meeting, but in some ways it's also a religious festival, and also things like I mentioned the parade, where Caesar, for example, is celebrating a triumph. This is a religious festival. Initiation into shrine cults. So this is one that people maybe know about, that many local shrines of paganism will have like essentially a mystery cult that's surrounding them, and you will go through an initiation ritual in order to be one of the initiates or into the priesthood of that particular cult, whether it's the Eleusinian mysteries in Athens or serving as a Vestal Virgin in the Roman Empire, that kind of thing, and Rome. Military and confraternity memberships. And so this is part of the regular people experience big time. So for example, at every crossroads are very inauspicious places where any number of things can happen. So a lot of times there'll be like a little shrine that'll be set up. There'll be a local, like essentially Shriners Club, not the Shriners aren't named for that reason, but anyway, like the Masons or any kind of confraternity, so guys getting together to drink, and then also maintain the shrine. And then they also have things like, they are also like an association that's like the local fire brigade. So if any one of the fire breaks out in their neighborhood, all the guys that are at the bar are supposed to go and put the fire out. Or another thing that they all do, for example, is a covenant that they will bury each other. So it's like essentially funeral inserts. The last thing you want, again, as a pagan, is to have your remains just to be scattered and the dogs get it or something like that. So you want to be able to have a propitious burial so that you're not in some kind of afterlife where you are in a perpetual state of agony because you haven't had a proper honorable burial. And so essentially that confraternity, again, they all swear essentially that they'll bury their brother or that kind of thing. And so confraternities. Participation in civic festivals. That could include things like in the Roman sense of having games or going to the Colosseum and also the circus, the horse races, chariot races. Hearing and learning myths and poetry, that's one of the ones like I mentioned that we think a lot about, but it is a component, but it's not the only thing. We had one a month ago about astrology. As soon as everybody had the idea that the stars are foretelling future, and you were able to learn about, especially when you're going to die, based on it, but also then people can't get over that. So everybody's interested in astrology, participation in markets, so just basic commercial activity. It can only be done on days that are favorable, and not on any of the days that are nephos. Here's a civic game that's different from civic festival. But anyway, so you got that. I already mentioned that. Gladiators and stuff. Plays. So plays we also have seen when we've done, we talked about ancient comedy and ancient tragedy. This is a religious festival. Studying philosophy is also part of this. So this is adding, for example, ideas of ethics and other kinds of meaning and behavior to ritual practice. Ethics, dealings with others, and also issues of personal morality and also ideas of austerity. So in the course of the Roman times, people were also deciding whether abstaining from bodily things, if that was able to be liberating to your intellect and spirit and things like that, for example. So why does that system break down if you have that kind of whole big composite of the old gods? So there's problems with impiety. So monotheistic religions, and we've talked about this a bunch of different times, struggle with the problem of evil often. And so the problem of evil is this idea as if you believe in a all-powerful single source of the divine, omnipotent and
Omniscient.
omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God and also that evil exists. You can't have all.
Right.
Actually, they combined omnipotent and omniscient into one because an all-knowing God would be all-powerful, so they usually don't duplicate it. So it's omniscient, omnibenevolent, and evil exists. You can't
Right.
have all three. You have to be able to let go of one of the three
Right.
in order to.
Exactly. So right. So if there's, like you say, the first part of it, like you say, niscient and niscient. So in other words, you're all-knowing, all-powerful, and then you add in the omnibenevolence. So in other words, God is goodness itself, for example, as we had like in Plato, or in Christianity. So if that's the case, why is there all this evil? So we have all of this evil. So how does that all work? And so that's a huge. It's essentially the major complaint for all of monotheism, and it's the main argument against monotheism, ultimately. And so that's not a problem for paganism, because paganism, none of the gods are omnipotent and omniscient. They are all plenipotent, which is to say they have much power. The power is greater than human power, and they may well be pleniscient. They may well know more than people, but they don't know everything.
Nice.
And they don't have to be nice. So anyway, they're definitely not, omnibenevolent, right? So in other words, some of them are really quite awful, and so you don't have to. So there's no problem in explaining why are people who are righteous suffering, people who are good, because it turns out that you have crossed somehow, no matter how good you might be, you haven't done the right ritual behavior, and some God now is essentially on your case. And the only thing you can do is to try to get, for example, the Furies or whoever to stop tormenting you through some kind of massive propitious behavior that you're able to maybe do to try to get out of that. And in some cases, you're fated and there's nothing you can do. So that's no problem in terms of the problem of evil is not a problem for paganism. But paganism then struggled with problems of impiety. And pietas in the Roman sense means not so much like having faith or having this kind of thing, but rather it's faithful observance of obligation that you have. So if you really are doing all of these ritual observances very faithfully and obligation, then the question is then, why then do impious people who are constantly, cursing the gods or saying things braggadociously or that kind of thing, why do they seem to have divine favor, and why do the pious people suffer if they have actually followed all those different rituals? And so aren't all of these customary obligations ultimately hollow? People started asking themselves. And so if we do all of these things, for example, is that actually good? So it may well be that we are doing ritual sacrifice and things like that because that's in observance to divine command. But how is that, for example, making the world a better place or helping in my immediate neighborhood all the widows, for example, who are going hungry or something like that? Are there standards of ethical behavior that maybe we should be considering here? So this is like a challenge that philosophy, for example, is having within more conservative or traditional component of paganism. And so we've talked about this in a number of different places. One of these ideas of these stages, whether they can't be, this is a very simplified model, but as people are trying to struggle with these things, sometimes people have identified these as different stages of how religions work or how people relate to this. So animism being an earliest kind of stage, paganism that we've just been talking about being this sort of intermediate stage, and then more recently what we're much more familiar with in modern times, or ever since actually medieval times, world religions. And so just to kind of look at kind of how, especially the transition here that's important, we've just explained kind of how paganism is working. So divine forces that we've seen, things like death, things like fate, things like lightning, these are personified, like the ocean, rivers. We kind of personify those as human-like gods who nevertheless also represent those forces. And so in some sense, everybody in understanding how anything moves, that if I pick up this, a person picked that up, that's why it goes up. So if you wonder how is it that a lightning bolt actually acts and moves, you assume then, well, someone is like essentially picking up and throwing it. So having that kind of active force and anthropomorphizing it, it's a fairly natural, I think, human thing. We anthropomorphize all kinds of stuff. Maybe if you have a car, you think of your car as a person because it has these two little eyes, as headlights. Or anyway, we anthropomorphize, and it misbehaves. Yeah.
My computer is a person.
Leander's computer is a person. I think everybody.
There's a difference between anthropomorphize and personify. Right? There's a difference between anthropomorphize and personify. So personify is ascribing character traits to non-human or ascribing human qualities to non-human objects, and
Anthropomorphize.
Oh my God. Isn't it? It's different.
Okay.
It's a different ascribing.
Well, so we do both. We also personify. and so, for example, I guess personifying is like everybody who has a dog now, that dog is their child. And so it's in a...
Sounds like it has, personify sounds like it has, there's a particularism, like a particular individual, but anthropomorphize sounds like it's just general humanity. It's being projected, like you're projecting, but in the first instance, you might be projecting
Right.
a particular,
So I guess the
in the second,
individual-
just, general
So the individual God is personified, but just seeing sources in anthropomorphic terms.
You're bringing an abstract object into reality, something that you can touch, where personification is taking something that's human and placing it on something else. So it's taking in as opposed to putting out.
Got it. So, as we've already talked about then, these kind of gods, that as people are understanding these different forces, they're not ethically predictable, but they have understood them to be able to be propitiated, as we saw. The magistrate class is actually in charge of the kind of rituals, so it's not that there's in general, there's not like a separation where there's like a priesthood that is its own, like separate thing from the actual civic leaders. And the whole focus is essentially obedience to law through different kinds of prescribed behaviors. And so one of the things then that is happening then in this transition at this time in Roman times here is there's now coming to be this idea that there is, let's say, a source of order in the universe. So as people have now really been doing their astrology and astronomy and deciding and realizing, wait a second, it may well be that these lightning bolts that keep hitting everybody are not very predictable, but there are some things we really can predict about the heavens. So we know that all of the planets are all moving in this zodiac, and we can actually know exactly how long they're going to move and how long, we can figure that all out. And at a certain point, their mathematics is good enough that they can predict lunar and solar eclipses. And so lots of this stuff is quite predictable. And so there is maybe an order to the universe. Individual actions then are starting to be seen that is, if there is this kind of order, we maybe are now seeing that our individual actions and knowledge are important to that order. And so then philosophers and other reformers then are calling for ethical behavior. And so the concern then it also moves beyond self-clan and city and present life. So there starts to be concerned about in the past, and so in this earlier time period when you were more focused, let's say, on your city or on your tribe or your clan, the fact that you yourself as an individual, since you don't have as separate an identity from clan, it isn't as important about you as what's going on, because clan is going to go on in the same way that you've been revering all of your ancestors and that kind of a thing. But at a certain point when there is a lot more focus on individualism, people then are starting to ask, well, wait a second, what's happening to me? And so then I'm going to be dead here, and this kind of thing. And so there's a question about, individual afterlife and continuity and things like that. So one of the ways that we've talked about this is we've talked about this as an axial age, and whether or not this isn't entirely, people don't all like this as a model, but partially it's because of the transmission idea. So in other words, is there some place where all these ideas emerged, or are they all kind of emerging on their own? And I'm not going to argue either of those, but rather just to say that as we are entering this kind of before the Roman times, this time period when there are starting to be cosmopolitan empires. So when you're moving from individually focused Iron Age hill kingdoms like Jerusalem to places like the Persian Empire, where you have a large cosmopolitan empire with multiple different peoples within it, this is when these cosmopolitan world religions and also their different ethical and other kinds of concerns kind of all take off, and they take off kind of around the same kind of extended centuries and eras across kind of the old world. And so the question, I always have whenever we're doing history is rather than, have it our own presentist lens and we know the direction everything did go, instead, go back to the factors and the things of the time, and were there other possibilities? Was there another way that things might have gone? And so if we have this kind of pagan Roman Empire, and if we're describing essentially that there was a breakdown of the ways in which all of that whole network of ritual obligation was ceasing to be as satisfying for people as they were developing new philosophies, as they were worrying about individual self and their continuance, as they were less rooted in their own clan identity and instead now had the wealth to maybe travel around a cosmopolitan empire where you may well start life in Syria and then end up on the frontier with Scotland and things like that. And so therefore you're way less rooted in like your local ancestral gods and neighborhood and everything like that, and are now interested in something bigger. Was paganism then therefore kind of doomed in having met world religions, whether or not it's Christianity or any other one? And so therefore, in other words, an inevitable that we were going to hit a Christian Roman Empire or some other world religion would come in at some point or other and conquer the Roman world religiously. So, although we're dealing here with the hazards of counterfactual now, so I'm going to go ahead and envision a different sequence of events where the Roman Empire doesn't become the Christian Roman Empire and becomes pagan. So, in the whole old world that we kind of did in terms of axial age and axial age challenges to the old gods and old traditions, we have a couple of examples in South Asia and, for example, in Japan, in India and Japan, where the old gods survived the challenge of world religions that appeared and made the same kind of challenges to Greco-Roman paganism. And so, for example, Hinduism in India, Shinto in Japan. So we have that ancient strata of it's not Hinduism the way we have it now, but an earlier proto-Hindu religions across India that are in some senses Indian style of paganism if you go back to that time period 3,000 years ago. It was then affected by the emergence of the indigenous world religions of Buddhism and Jainism, for example. And so that caused reactions within, again, the different Hinduisms. It's not all one thing. It's actually multiple different local religions that are lumped into that category, but essentially continuing practices, continuing reverence for the old gods, the original gods and the texts. And therefore, it in and of itself, then when it encounters Islam, which is a very strong monotheist religion, in the early modern period, its reaction to that allowed Hinduism to take shape as its own essentially world religion that has all of these kind of components of world religions in it. Although it has maintained itself, it's also in its diversity that goes back in kind of these roots where essentially the old gods are still revered, temples are still there. A lot of the original things have happened, but it still has emerged not as, let's say, a living relic of how paganism was operated 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, but rather a new way in this new world among its peers of other kinds of world religions. And we can argue that that same kind of thing happened in Japan. And so the spiritual crisis, and so going back to Rome, by the time we're getting to this moment when Christianity is emerging and is becoming a potential path for the Roman Empire to go, in the 3rd century, there is a spiritual crisis and an actual real-life crisis as the empire is divided by civil wars, and it leads to all kinds of political, economic collapses and things like that. One of the things that happens is we mentioned that there are Roman paganism is civic, and its priesthoods are also relying on essentially city magistrates, people who are the local leaders who have always been, let's say, our family has always been the leaders of Ephesus. And so I can always be called upon to be a decurion or a local magistrate of Ephesus, because that's part of how I'm getting my kind of honor, because I think of myself as an Ephesian. And so therefore, no matter how incredibly expensive it is, I'm prepared on my particular son's coming of age day, where he is being put into the curule magistrate's throne. I'm willing to throw this giant games, where we pay for all of these animals to come from Africa, and we fill our amphitheater with them, and we have like all of these games and kill them all, and everybody gets to see this amazing pagan festival. But it's actually just horrifically expensive to do this. But what ends up happening is that as you are ceasing to be as concerned again about the fact that I'm part of this clan, that I'm focused on this long tradition, and I'm less worried about the civic tribe of being an Ephesian, and maybe I'm more focused on my own kind of, let's say, philosophical exploration and what's going to happen, let's say, in my particular what's moral for me to do, or my own afterlife. I decreasingly am interested in this amazingly costly part of being a Roman noble. And so in fact, at a certain point in the 3rd century here, essentially they have to make all these laws to force decurions in order to keep being in charge. So all of these local leaders, and say, you have to stay on the council, you can't go off the city council. Before it had been this honor that everybody would pay to be on, and they pay massively. Now it's so expensive, it bankrupts everybody, people aren't interested in it, and so essentially all of this kind of civic life, which is also what paganism even is, starts to break down and fall apart. So then it's increasingly difficult then to find decurions who want to shoulder this expense. And so then essentially in the middle of this 3rd century, just all public building ceases. So it's not that when we think of the Roman Empire, we think of one of the whole things about being a Roman and having a Roman city is you have an amphitheater, you have a theater, you have a circus, you have these particular temples, all of these kind of public buildings, walls, and aqueduct. These are the things that make you a Roman. But there's not like some kind of a massive federal government that is paying for all of this kind of public works through like a nationally collected income tax or something like that. The way that's all happening is that every one of these Roman roads is called things like the Via Aemilia, because the Aemiliani clan paid for the Via Aemilia. And so same thing. The Arch of Titus is called that because of the Titus paid for that, right? So in other words, these kind of the theater of Pompey. Pompey made that theater, and so you want to have all of these kind of structures named for you and named for your clan. But at a certain point here, like I say, in the 3rd century, they just stopped building anything. There's nothing. So yeah.
Well, in many cases, these very powerful Roman families also had generals and such in the mix, and they'd go off and and colonize and/or be off in the colonies and extract enormous amounts of money.
Oh yeah.
From various colonies and/or from conquest. Was it that too was, let's say, not as lucrative as it used to be?
So yeah, the question is, so for example, like in the case of Pompey that I gave that one, or some of these other guys who are making like the amphitheater, so the Flavian amphitheater. So when you're making that kind of a thing, like you say, these nobles are getting it in part because they've been a consul, and then they've been made a proconsul, they're in charge of an army, and they go and they plunder Carthage. And so when you do that, you got a lot more money, right? But I'm just saying, even at the lower level of, let's say you're the administrator in, let's say the 10th largest city in Asia Minor, in Turkey, they still locally, they wouldn't get to be a general that gets to plunder anybody, but you maybe do get to go off and be a procurator, and you get to plunder a province. And that continues. So they're still, locally collecting taxes. They're still doing that kind of thing. And one of the things that is still happening, especially in the West, is just ever increasing estates. And so they have this giant latifunda estates where you just own almost an entire province and you're working it with your own slaves and things like that. So there's still just a massive wealth in these kinds of, at least especially in the senatorial aristocracy, but even in these local provincialist aristocracies. But increasingly, it's impossible to get people to spend their money on the local civic pagan things that they always used to do. And so essentially the contract breaks down.
Like the 1% never wants to spend money.
Well, they did for a while, so it was working, but now they don't want to anymore, and so they stop. And so in fact, the building stops. So archaeologically, we just don't have any for this whole time period. So anyway, so one of the things then, as an alternative path, I'm going to argue here is that one of the possibilities is that having been confronted then with the challenges, traditionalism and paganism in the Greco-Roman world is challenged by Greek philosophy. And in fact, this time period is one of the most popular, I've argued, one of the most popular times for philosophy ever in history, where a very large, relative to, any time previously, so it's still it only has penetrated so far popularly, but several percentage of the population, as opposed to just a handful of people in ivory towers, are actually thinking about Stoicism and are committing themselves to saying, I'm a Stoic, and wanting to live that kind of a way. And so as local leaders then increasingly turn away from this civic expenditure, which is to say ritual pagan life, they are finding other ways for spiritual meaning. And so it's this great era of popular practical philosophy. And I think it's conceivable that the Roman world religion may have evolved out of a kind of reverence for the old gods, but with, for example, Stoic morality. So that could have gotten infused together, and the old gods and the old shrines and things like that could have survived, as we see in India or in Japan, but in a new fused form of essentially with the overlay of philosophy. And so nominally the same, the new religion would be very different then from that religion of Pliny the Elder that we talked about when we talked about all of those ritual observances. And so that's one path then, right? So the one path would have been world religion of Greek philosophy has impacted the old ways, and that has created a new philosophical pagan Roman Empire, as opposed to the world religion of Christianity coming in and making a Christian Roman Empire. And so the answer for why one path and not the other, we've had this before, is Constantine, right? So the fact that the emperor decides to pick Christianity. And so Constantine is the great game changer of every one of these different paths. So there may well have been an inevitable religious evolution, because it's happening everywhere. Constantine's conversion had major ramifications for the particular path that the West took. And so I think that in my reading of it, his conversion, a lot of times people say that Constantine converted for some kind of political expedience, but there's so few Christians and they're so unimportant that I don't think that he's actually getting very much out of it. It's especially not that popular necessarily among the army initially. And really that's what the emperors have to especially worry about. However much he may have not understood Christianity when he signed up for it, what he did sign up for was he's fighting a civil war with other emperors. He's trying to knock them out and become the sole emperor. And he believes anyway, a vision where in the sign, a Christian sign, if he adopts that, it will bring victory. He does that in the battle. He knocks out Maxentius, and as a result, this is a god that, as we even see back to that Roman maxim, do ut des, you give in order that I give. He gave, at that moment with that bit of augury insight that he's going to adopt that god's sigil or whatever, and then that god gave him victory. And for a warrior emperor, that was all that mattered. He later then figured out what it was all about. I think he probably didn't know that much, when he first started into it. And so I think that rather than having an economic or political motive, That's probably why he went with it. It didn't necessarily gain anything from it. So he had a long, long reign, and this is one of those examples of when you have a monarchy, the monarch ends up being really important to what direction things go, because things can go, it's a fairly unstable system depending on if you have some very bad do-nothing monarch or a succession of weak monarchs who continually die and are never able to make a power base, or if you have one person like anybody from like Queen Elizabeth or Queen Elizabeth II here, who lives so long that they put their imprint on it for good or ill, right? So whatever anybody thought the British monarchy or the Canadian monarchy was prior to Elizabeth II, I don't know that anybody remembers it now because she's just been here forever, and so no one knows. And in fact, it's actually frightening to think about her not being around. And I'm hoping that she's still around in a couple months here when I actually take the oath of citizenship, because I'd rather do it to her than the alternative that's going to happen. Anyway. So, anyway, Tim was going to say.
I was going to say, isn't it the same for the Pope?
Oh, in the same, yeah. So the Pope is also a monarch, and so that's also true for a papal monarch, right? And so the papal monarchy, when you have one long-ruling pope like Gregory the Great or somebody who puts this amazing stamp on the thing, John Paul II, who has affected the papacy a lot in the second half of the 20th century, because on the one hand he was a fighter against communism, and so he had that. On the other hand, he was he was very reactionary, and so therefore put a big social reactionary stamp on Catholicism, because he picked all the bishops for all of this time. So a monarch can do both different kinds of things depending on what happens. And so Constantine, because he is a very strong emperor who is actually it rules for a whole long time, he affected everything a lot. And so as a result of that, that gave a time period for when he didn't make. It's sometimes thought that Constantine made Christianity the religion's empire. He just is a patron of it, and he also actually organized it, gave it a structure, and really changed. Essentially, he founded a Christian church. Before that, Christianity is multiple competing bishoprics and dioceses and things like that. He introduces things like the ecumenical council, which becomes the way that Christianity identifies itself as an institution. He creates the sort of Roman, on the Roman model, a diocese we now think of as a Catholic thing. It's actually just a Roman name for a province. And so he creates the structure where bishops are under, essentially provincial bishops have local bishops under them. So he creates the idea of a metropolitan bishop, which had never existed before. And so by creating that kind of structure, he essentially creates the church as an institution, which he then patronizes lavishly with all of the money that the imperial government has. So essentially bishops become imperial officers or imperial officials, or at least patronized by the imperial officials, and therefore they are able to be sources of patronage within cities in the same way that before local magistrates would have been doing that, right? And so what ends up happening is that it took root as a result of that during his reign. Then when his successor, Julian, sometimes called Julian the Apostate, because he leaves Christianity. He's raised Christian, but he decides that instead that he wants to get rid of all this Christian stuff, and he wants to create a pagan revival. If he hadn't died in battle very quickly, then that could have changed everything again. So the fact that Julian didn't live to see his counter-revolution happen is one of the reasons why it didn't happen, And so again, because of a monarchy. But one of the things that, interestingly, I think would have happened with Julian is that, so what he did, again, since Christianity is not the state religion, but what he did was essentially he pulled back all the patronage. So the imperial government was no longer giving subsidies to any Christian bishops, and instead he functionally started to, on that Christian church model, organize paganism. So he started to now subsidize what functionally becomes a pagan church. And so by giving essentially organization to all of that. And so I would argue that what might have happened is if Julian had lived and Christianity had not been patronized by the imperial government, what we might have ended up with is a pagan Roman Empire, but has a pagan world religion that is almost identical and has almost no differentiation between with what the Christian Middle Ages was anyway. It would just have a different mythology, some different rituals. It would have different understanding of, it would actually still be monotheist because philosophically the pagans had gotten to that point anyway. But it would understand essentially that there were these lesser emanations of minor gods in the same way that Hindus will often tell you sometimes that they're monotheist in the sense that they believe in one divine force, of which then the millions of gods are simply like angels or avatars or whatever it is that are emanations within that broader divinity. Yeah, sorry.
But wasn't paganism in effect organized under the aegis of Christianity, because so much of paganism was indeed absorbed into Christian practice? I mean, there were many folk pagan practices that refused to let go, and so there was conversion of local deities into saints, and rites and rituals into pagan rites and rituals to ones associated with Christian celebrations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So much of it, in fact, was absorbed. It just took on another guise, but often thinly disguised.
Yes. And so actually, you make the exact point that I'm actually kind of making from the other angle here, which is that whereas nominally, between these two emperors, this path that we're having where we have a Christian Roman Empire and a path where we have a nominally pagan Roman Empire, or nominally Christian Roman Empire, they almost don't look different at all in the historical outcomes. In other words, because the same trends are all happening, the same kind of movement towards things like asceticism, being anti-body, anti-sex, all the pagans are all feeling that way too at this kind of time period in the Roman Empire. All of these kinds of, like you say, pagan festivals and rituals and things like that that get absorbed into Christianity. In other words, those would have all just survived in a completely different way, and all the things that essentially this church structure and everything like that Christianity had is this kind of thing that would have gotten slaughtered over by Julian onto the pagan system. So in that sense, and again, the philosophical underpinnings of it, it might have been Stoicism as opposed to Neoplatonism, which is what ended up surviving through Christianity. I'm just saying all of that is largely similar. A same kind of general path is going to happen, I'm suggesting, which on a map and a high end and nominally looks night and day different, but in terms of functionality may well be very, very similar.
Yeah, the description of some of the aspects of paganism sounded very familiar. Thinking of propitiation. There's a song that we probably all know in English, but it was written in French. Pour minuit chrétien, c'est l'heure solennelle où l'homme Dieu descendit jusqu'à nous. Pour effacer la tâche originelle et de son père arrêter le courroux. To efface the original sin and propitiate the Father's anger.
Right? Yeah.
There we are, propitiation.
Yeah, well, we have had lectures before about how December 25th is not biblical, but is instead actually the birthday of the sun, which is to say the sun that lights us, and heats us, this kind of sun in terms of an actual physical sun, as opposed to the metaphorical light and the sun with an O in English, right? So it's the birthday of the indomitable sun, and that cult was also celebrated by Constantine. So he was a devotee of that particular pagan cult. And so anyway, all those kind of things have survived. So, anyway, so in this kind of way, then how did it happen? So in Constantinople, we then have this power of imperial patronage. So Rome had ceased to be the administrative capital. Now Constantine and his successors built this new capital centered on Christian monuments. Other strengths that Christianity did have at this time While philosophy required significant education, Christian leaders formulated doctrinal creeds that anybody could memorize. So essentially you have the theology underlying it, but then once you have the Nicene Creed, you can say these things which are very complicated, and I argue many times people don't ever understand what the Trinity, how it works. Nevertheless, you can memorize it, and you can memorize slogans that you know will make your philosophical enemies mad, so which they did in the riots in Constantinople. Yes, Shaheen.
I just wanted to add quickly that like under Theodosius in 381, pagans weren't allowed to approach temples with the intent of sacrifice.
Yes.
And then 382, they were banned from entering temples in the east. And in Syria and in Mesopotamia in around 380s, bishops and monks would go around destroying temples with the government, or
government turning a blind eye. Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that ultimately happened is that this is a with the complicity of the imperial government. So initially, with Constantine, we mentioned, and with then his successor Julian, there was this system with the Edict of Milan, essentially a policy of religious tolerance. You could be whatever religion you want in the Roman Empire, but when you get to Theodosius at the end of the century, that's over. And so now Theodosius makes Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire, and essentially it means we've created a new system where what it is to be Roman means you are Christian, and therefore, like you say, all of the different old temples of the old gods and all of the different celebrations. So they end the Olympics, for example. They end the Academy. They end all any other kinds of like you say, the temples. I mentioned here. It's like this is another exactly what you said. There's a slide here or a point here. Christian bishops, patronized by the imperial government, led churches and cities that provide alms for the poor. No, it's this one is the one. Zealous Christian monks and hermits, they're performing all these feats of self-mortification. So people think that's amazing, but the other thing that they would do is they would walk into a temple and they would curse that god, and they'd say, well, why doesn't the god strike me down? And then they would take the cult statue and they'd throw it over, and if the god has any power, why make him strike me now? And then they take an axe and they cut the statue's head off, and they say, well, where's your God's power now? And the priests don't have any recourse, right? Because the imperial government won't do anything to punish anybody from doing that. So, and anyway, while they're doing that, those holy men then are also doing all kinds of other, miraculous things like living up on top of columns for 40 years, and people find that to be pretty amazing that they, are fasting and are performing feats of bodily mortification and that kind of thing. And then one of the things that happens is that because the bishops who are patronized by the imperial government, they're in the cities, they start providing some of this civic function, so providing alms for poor, works of charity that might have previously been part of the civic administration. So the same zeal, power that allowed monks to live on columns also animated their desire to smash the shrines. So I guess that's anticipating what we were talking about. So this is like a little miniature here of Theodosius. Christians are destroying them, pulling the statues down and destroying them, and effectively then banning paganism. And so then they are able to argue, well, why didn't God stop them? The gods stop them if they have any kind of power, and so that, anyway, and they're the ones writing down the history, so there's nobody who's able to give a response. So anyway, then ground that had been holy to pagans was then Christianized. So you take that temple, as we saw with the cathedral in Syracuse, and now suddenly that's a cathedral. You take and bury a Christian martyr or monk on the site, and so suddenly now we're no longer it's no longer a shrine to Asclepius. It's now St. Nicholas, who is dwelling there. And so it may well be that you're in the lived life of a pagan. Let's say your dear great aunt, who would always go to the shrine of Asclepius on Asclepius's holy day in order to, because to help her rheumatism. Now she goes and she prays she goes and prays at what's now the shrine of St. Nicholas, and maybe the exact same way, and maybe St. Nicholas is now curing her rheumatism. and so, or intervening in order to have that happen. And so in that sense, the practices or the lived experience may well go on as the shrines then nominally are changed and overstructured. One of the things that happened is because there was no paid clergy or overall church structure, paganism isn't really able to organize any kind of unified resistance. So essentially you go into Gaul and you cut down some poor druid's tree. It's not like all of the priests in Egypt are worried about that. It's not the same. We call it paganism, but they aren't actually on the same page as each other in that sense, and they also don't have a kind of the Egyptian church actually does. The Egyptian priests actually do have a structure, but everybody else doesn't have that kind of a structure, and so that's hard for them to have a unified resistance. And so in sum then, one of the things that happens, I think, in all of history is there's continuity and innovation. So lots of things are happening, lots of trends are happening. New things occur, but they don't necessarily cause total sea changes. In fact, they tend to absorb a lot of the strains that are happening. So although we have this traditional narrative of late antiquity, and we have this idea that there's this radical transformation from paganism to Christianity, that's obviously inarguable in a nominal sense, but the narrative then ignores just this massive survival of Roman institutions, ideas that continued altered under the new Christian banner. And so Christians retained the institutions, including, for example, the imperial government, Roman law, the classical education system, including pagan literature, Latin, classical philosophy, and they repurposed sacred sites, festivals, the calendar, and more. And so ultimately, Roman ideals in their merged guise survived the political fall of the empire in the West, as bishops then preserved Roman civicism and monasteries preserved Latin civilization. And so as we kind of saw when we looked at this at the beginning, the Temple of Athena, it's a Catholic cathedral in Syracuse, the sacred space. It was also a mosque and a Greek Orthodox church in its time. And these things, there's continuity and innovation. So we have questions or?
By the way, we have Barry and Midland.
Oh, Barry and Midland Center Places. Yeah. Welcome to you guys.
I'm just curious, is there something else happening here underlying all world religious development comparatively that is not religious but speaks to some other social development?
So the question is complicated, I think, because I think we have a trouble defining what the word religion means. And so you say, is there something else that's all going on here that's not simply religious? Because I think that this word that we have for religion is in part based on our inherited traditions that we have in the West, again, in Christendom. So that when we get to this idea, when we make up the word religion, right? So the English didn't have the word religion until the 16th century. Prior to, it's a Latin word, so it does mean something. But prior to that, in Middle English and things like that, the word, if you're talking about somebody and you call them religious, what does that mean? It means they're a monk or a nun. And so they have a word for that, but they don't have anything, because everybody's religious in the sense that we now kind of have made this. And so I think that our word religious that we have now is based on our inherited cordoned off zone of a particular kind of religion, which is essentially like clericism, which is the inherited churches of the Western world. So we think of religion as being those small group of things that we've now dotted a dotted line around and say this is Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or something like that, and we understand it that way. Whereas all the way up until the Enlightenment, all the way up until modernity, all of these things, like I did in my little graphic there, where I was showing like going to a play, going to a sporting event, living in your house, having a family, all of those things were religious for pagans. And so it's this strange idea that we have in a modern sense where we have cordoned off religion in a little zone and said that that's what religion is. And now more recently, we have created a religion of secularism or whatever, where we maybe don't think that that zone is even useful anymore. But what I think is actually true is that religion is actually existing everywhere outside that little zone, including watching TV and doing ritual activities and having any kind of civic things that we're doing now, even though we don't call it religious. And so anyway, so as a result, it's complicated to even say. So yeah, is there something bigger going on? Yeah, I think all of everything is interconnected in this kind of thing, and that it's our own more recent lenses where we're trying to divide this off and cordon off religion in its own little section.
I'm wondering if it seems to me there were two things about Christianity that would have been very attractive. One was obviously the promise of an afterlife.
Afterlife, yeah.
The story about, I think this was in medieval or Dark Ages England. There was a comparison of human life to a sparrow flying into the hall, being in there briefly in the firelight and flying out again. And that's human life. We don't know what happens before it. We don't know what happens after it. And so here are these Christian missionaries to tell us.
Yeah.
And the other thing that must have been very attractive, it was certainly attractive to John Dryden, who went back to being a Catholic, is the claim of universality. That, okay, here were all these little local shrines and little local gods who only govern little local, maybe a couple of miles.
Yeah.
Of course, in those days, most people never went more than a few miles away from home. But here was this religion that claimed to be universal.
Yes.
And this must have been ferociously attractive.
Yeah. Yeah. So no, I think that like you say, that those are like two of the core things that are also common, and those are among the things that exist in world religions, right? So a lot of times a world religion is pulling into universality, and they don't all, but anyway, and then in a lot of cases, this individual concern for self and soul and the afterlife and that kind of a thing. And so obviously Christianity had those going for it. Those are on the list. But what I guess I'd argue is that, for example, that's existing within the potential reform of paganism that philosophy is offering. So Plato is also, for example, arguing for an immortality of the soul very strongly, and Plato is also arguing for universality, right? And so it might have been very possible, but Plato, I was very aware, one of the reasons why when he makes his Republic, I think he decides that he's going to ban poets and he won't let anybody teach any mythology. He says it explicitly, is that because the traditional mythology, the traditional gods as they're understood and told, and we hear about them in Homer and things like that, don't correspond very readily or easily with this new reform or world religion that Plato is offering of universality and good, and where God is, or the divine or the source or whatever is goodness itself. And so in that sense, by swapping out all of like Homer for a scripture or a sacred text or mythology that is already focused on, let's say, one God, and in the case of more and more so on God being good and that kind of a thing in the Christian text, then that I think fits that a lot more easily. And so in some ways it's a big thing to get rid of your people. We still know characteristics of Venus and Aphrodite and Cupid and Zeus, because we have all of this artistic imagery that it's very hard to swap it all out, right? But it's a big investment to switch over that kind of a thing. But nevertheless, in some sense, it was easier maybe for then that underlying structure of ethical philosophy that was maybe seemingly more compatible with the Christian structure.
This is a much more modern story of conversion. I think I've told this story before. Years ago, a Quaker friend of mine was in Kenya at a big gathering of Quakers. And she was talking to a local guy whose parents had converted to Quakerism. And being a very blunt-spoken woman, she asked why. Presumably they had a perfectly functional traditional religion.
Yeah.
He said, it freed us from fear.
Mm. Well, so that is one point, is that, again, like I say, if you are, in this kind of religion of the old gods, the earlier paganism, it is a scary worldview in a lot of different ways. We have all of these historical shows in Hollywood, and everybody does such a bad job with history. But the one that I've been watching lately, The Last Kingdom, I'm going to recommend it, because this is one about King Alfred the Great and essentially him fighting against the Danes and everything like that. And they are showing, I think, a more reasonable idea of the kind of problems that all the Danes are having as being pagans, and some of the scarier things about their worldview than we normally get. Where, anyway, like for example, the show Vikings, which is not, I don't recommend. So anyway.
Is superstition a holdover from pagan rituals, or is that something innate in the human condition that people are superstitious? And do you think that has some bearing on how religious a person is, whether they are superstitious or not?
Well, so superstition is another one of these complicated words like religion. Superstition is a word that goes all the way back. The Romans had it, and so the Romans used the word superstition for all the people's beliefs that weren't theirs, and that kind of a thing, and so how do we use superstition now? So superstition now, we tend to, if it has an actual meaningful sense, it's things more like knock on wood and throwing salt over your shoulder and those kind of ritual things. In that sense, those kind of ritual behaviors are holdovers from, that's something that pagans were doing, all of those kind of things. And so whether individual ones, crossing fingers probably goes back a long ways. A lot of these things probably go back a long, saying bless you after a sneeze. So these, in those senses, are superstitious, and there's also relationship between that and, if you want to call it superstition, it's also a relationship between that, for example, and let's say sympathetic magic. This is one where I talk about when you're watching soccer or football and the people have kicked the ball and it's going towards the goal, and you go, or hockey, I guess, and the puck is going, you go, oh, to make it, because you do, and everybody from across your TV all across the world is doing that in order to make the ball go into the net, right? And so that's because by you doing that, it does that. The same way that if you have like a memento of like a locket of the person's hair, any number of those kind of things. So in those senses, a lot of those things are how people function, and that's why I think even people who consider themselves to be wholly secular and to have gotten past superstition or religion, they may well be very susceptible still to coincidence, say. So, one of the ways that people say, they keep on going past this thing and they keep seeing signs for something, and so the universe is telling them, that they need to make this change in their life, that because they keep seeing that thing, right? And so, anyway, part of the issue, I think, is that when we have where we disassociate ourselves from institutions or ways that we can actually explore these kind of ideas like we do here in the Tuesday night group, people then, if they don't have a tradition that's organized, they sometimes are doing their own tradition, and they might just be doing it organically, and so then they might fall into those kind of coincidence-based superstitions or something like that, seeing meaning in coincidence or anything, So yeah, and in some senses it's a holdover because this is just human nature. In some senses, if it's an organized thing that's a tradition that people have gone on and on, that's something that can be passed down. And it may well be one that we identify, where it's something like Gesundheit, but it could be something that you don't even think of as being a ritual, like, the get into the goal, or any number of things like that. So
there's a lot more than that.
There's a lot of other ones, yeah. So.
Yeah. I have a book about Christianity and paganism.
Oh, cool.
And there's a neat reference to a letter that was sent in the early 700s.
Okay.
I'm just going to kind of just jump into the description here. There are perfectly explicit testimonies from indisputable medieval authorities explaining the slow process of conquest that Christianity was forced to develop in a region of the world to which it had no prior claim. So this is on the periphery of the former empire, now Christendom in Britain.
Oh, yeah.
One such account is a letter from Pope Gregory the Great by way of Abbot Meletius to St. Augustine of Canterbury, who was spreading the gospel among the Angles of England, and that's at in the early 700s. And the letter goes, "We wish you to inform him that we have been giving careful thought to the affairs of the English and have come to the conclusion that the temples of the idols among the people should on no account be destroyed. The idols are to be destroyed, but the temples themselves are to be aspersed with holy water, altars set up in them, and relics deposited there. For if these temples are well built, they must be purified from the worship of demons and dedicated to the service of the true God." So there's the universality.
Yeah.
In this way, we hope that the people, seeing that their temples are not destroyed, may abandon their error and, flocking more readily to their accustomed resorts, may come to know and adore the true God. And because they have a custom of sacrificing many oxen to demons, let some other solemnity be substituted in its place, such as a day of dedication or the festivals of the holy martyrs whose relics are enshrined there. On such occasions, they might well construct shelters of boughs for themselves around the churches that were once temples and celebrate the solemnity with devout feasting.
Yeah. So that just shows, the Pope Gregory the Great is a very smart guy, and so he's even consciously describing essentially the program that I was saying organically happened. And so he's from a time period then, in that time period, they can't just go around smashing buildings at this point because everything's fallen. They can't build new buildings almost. So Theodosius, at what's still the height of imperial power, is able to go around and smash, pagan shrines and things like that. Now Gregory, like you say, off on the British frontier, he's like, just go ahead and, just sprinkle some holy water, and that kind of thing, and we're going to be able to, we'll repurpose them, So, yeah, very good example. Yes.
It seems to me that back then people were converting just mostly out of convenience than faith, because it doesn't seem that they had a lot of faith. They pretty much saw something that was offering something more, but not really because they felt that it's something that they should be doing as a Christian, converting into Christianism or whatever, just because it was more convenient for them to say, like, well, this is offering me a life probably after death or some other thing, but not really because they really had a faith.
So I guess I would say, even though I've explained like all of these kind of economic and other kinds of means of convenience, I would actually argue that people are pretty well the same all the way through. And so there are a group of people in this time period who are amazingly devout and who are very fervent and who are converting because of very heartfelt reasons that they'll actually have left to us. And so some of the people are very much devout, and they might have been a devout pagan who has a life-changing experience, and then they have a vision of Christ, or any number of things that cause them. They're ritually healed. This is an age of miracles. There's at least perceived miracles, and so the people really believe all those kind of things. It's also perceived miracles on behalf of the pagans. So in late paganism, philosophers are the same as sorcerers, and they all have tricks that they do or whatever in order to continue to impress the divine power that they have as well. So it's a devout time, and there's a whole kinds of believers, and there's reasons why some people are very, very fervent. But it's also true that a lot of times we think of people in the Middle Ages or Antiquity as being like way more devout than everybody is now. And actually what I think is true is that there's a whole bunch of people who this is not the thing that they care about, and they're more interested in all, either if they're a soldier, they're more interested in that, doing that, and not getting killed and that kind of thing. They're more interested in the next festival and what that's about, and whether the festival is to Pan or whether it's to Christ and the saints. They don't as much care because this is the time they get to eat a lot of food and get drunk. So I think that on the one hand, you have every different type of person in kind of all of these time periods, and for a vast bulk of people, like you say, they may well be doing things out of convenience and because or maybe they still are very devout. And like I say, they never really cared for the civic priest or whatever. They didn't maybe like that druid that was there at the tree. You know, he may have been a rotten guy, but they do know that when they went there, it made their rheumatism not. And so they might have believed very fervently in that. And so now that the tree is gone and they have a shrine there and the monk is there and blesses you and your rheumatism goes away, well, then maybe she's still devout, right? You know, so what I would argue is that we shouldn't think that they're more or less devout. That is happening. People are very fervent, but on the other hand, there's a huge swash of people who never cared about this kind of thing, you know. So very good. Well, let's call it a night, and we'll be able to take our discussion offline with snacks, and we'll invite everybody to stay for snacks and discussion. And meanwhile, we'll say bye to our folks in Barrie and Midland and everywhere else you're joining us, and thank you so much for being online with us.